¿Cuál es la capacidad país para satisfacer las necesidades de sus ciudadanos, para mejorar la calidad de vida de ellos y para desarrollar al máximo su talento humano? Sabemos que los indicadores económicos ya no responden a estas consultas. Por otro lado, ¿de qué se trata la planificación estratégica del siglo XXI? ¿Es planificar y hacer mejor las cosas que nuestra competencia? Bueno, una nueva visión de ambas realidades es la razón por la cual nos hemos reunido todos aquí. Les quiero dar la más cordial bienvenida a la conferencia Estrategias de Desarrollo para el siglo XXI, el imperativo social, el imperativo del progreso social y el crecimiento competitivo, a cargo del número 1, el referente mundial en competitividad, el afamado académico Michael Porter. Bueno, este evento no sería posible si no fuese por grandes compañías como Visión Banco y Bancard y también la de nuestros auspiciantes que hicieron posible que este gran sueño hoy sea una realidad. Ellos son BID, Capro, Cervepar, Diesa, Pharmacenter, Financiera al Comercio, Luminotecnia, Personal, Record Electric y Talavera y Ortellado Construcciones. Organizan PTF y el grupo impulsor del Índice de Progreso Social integrado por ADEC, el Club de Ejecutivos del Paraguay, Dende, Deloitte, FEPRINCO, Fundación Avina, Fundación Moisés Bertoni, Fundación Paraguaya, Global Shapers Community Asunción, MAE-UC y Red del Pacto Global Paraguay. El apoyo del ámbito privado y de organizaciones de la sociedad civil es fundamental para pensar en el futuro en cualquier país. Comprometidos con esta misión, estas organizaciones que acabo de mencionar se han sumado a este esfuerzo. Para dar inicio al encuentro y con el aplauso de todos ustedes, convocamos al escenario al director programático de la Fundación Avina y miembro del grupo impulsor del Índice de Progreso Social, señor Raúl Gauto.
Buenos días. Muchísimas gracias en nombre del grupo impulsor del Índice de Progreso Social por su presencia esta mañana, que para nosotros es un voto de confianza y por eso realmente queremos agradecerles. También queremos decirles que hemos tenido ya una primera sesión con el doctor Porter y el gabinete del presidente Cartes, que realmente ha sido una reunión sumamente productiva, interesante, coloquial, que nos está permitiendo pensar de que podemos realmente los paraguayos trabajar juntos. Y eso es probablemente un valor que tenemos que fortalecer y cultivar cada vez más. La presencia del doctor Porter en Paraguay se debe a que estamos descubriendo de manera sincrónica todos en el mundo que ya los indicadores económicos no reflejan la totalidad del espacio y el pensamiento, la temperatura social de los países. Hace varios años, el Foro Económico Mundial generó una reunión donde se planteaban justamente cómo complementar lo económico del foro con iniciativas sociales. Allí fue que surgió la idea del Índice de Progreso Social. Y allí fue que se generó este pensamiento de que tendríamos que convocar a pensadores del nivel de Michael Porter para que realmente ayudaran a conceptualizar este tipo de ideas. Acá en el Paraguay creemos que hemos podido generar un valor en blindar, en fortalecer nuestro Banco Central, el Ministerio de Hacienda, la política fiscal. Y también estamos comprendiendo que tenemos que blindar la política social. No es suficiente, y ya lo comprobamos los paraguayos, que solamente blindando el sector económico vamos a construir el país que queremos todos. En esta convicción es que el profesor Porter ha entendido que su índice de competitividad que él ayudó a desarrollar por muchos años debía ser complementado por el índice de progreso social. Y eso es lo que él ha venido haciendo en estos últimos 2 años, pero no solamente para medir y comparar a los países, sino que el concepto del índice de progreso social va mucho más allá y nos invita a avanzar, a generar políticas públicas utilizando los indicadores. Y eso es lo que en Paraguay el grupo impulsor está queriendo hacer y ojalá lo hagamos con la ayuda de todos ustedes. Entonces, quería explicarles esto para no abundar mucho en las credenciales del doctor Porter, que podríamos pasarnos toda la mañana en esto, pero sí explicarles a ustedes la relevancia del trabajo, del interés del doctor Porter de dedicar su energía, su creatividad, su capacidad al sector social, como lo ha venido haciendo ya en el mundo y también en Estados Unidos. Entonces, queríamos en este momento agradecer y también comprometernos con el doctor Porter a hacer de esta visita suya no un evento, sino el inicio de un proceso que convierta al Paraguay en un país de mucho mejor bienestar, de mucho más desarrollo humano que el que hoy día tenemos. Entonces, con estas palabras quiero agradecer al mismo tiempo al doctor Porter y presentarles a ustedes para que nos dé su conferencia esta mañana. Doctor Porter, por favor.
Well, what a day this is going to be with all of you here. I want to thank Raul for that very kind introduction, and I want to say how excited I am. I've been everywhere, but I never until today have been here to Paraguay, and I'm very excited about that. And the reason I'm here is that I think that something very important is going to happen. I think we have here in this country today an opportunity to make both economic but also social transformation. I've worked all over the world with many countries now for many years, and I have a feeling that something important is going to happen. But that's going to depend on all of us. On our attitudes, on our spirit, on our willingness to work together, on our ability to see the whole, not the individual pieces. But I think the opportunity is here in this country for something very important to happen, and that's why I'm here, and that's why we are so excited to work with you and the business community and the government and the civil society at this moment to make this transformation. Now, the subject of today's discussion is development. The development of this country, the improvement in the prosperity and quality of life of the citizens of this country. You know, Paraguay is a country with a long history. Some of that history is very proud history. Some of that history is not so good in terms of moving the society forward. But I think today the question is, you know, where do we go from here? We have a lot of history. We all know that history. Where do we go from here? What is the path that this country needs to get on? And what are its opportunities to transform itself? And that's what I'd like to talk about in this session today. I don't have all the answers. You have the answers. I don't have the answers. But what I have is I have, hopefully, the way to think about the answers, the way to think about defining the strategy for the country going forward. And that's what I'd like to cover in this session today. How do we create the right choices and the right strategy to transform the development of Paraguay? That's the question we all need to ask today. What are the roles of the various actors? How much of it is the job of government? How much of it is the job of civil society? How much of it is the job of the private sector? I think in the past, like many countries, the organization that was most responsible for leading the development of the country was government. But I think what we've learned is if government is forced to do it by itself, it won't succeed. So if we're going to make this transformation, I think the most important thing we have to do is actually work together. We have to understand that all the actors in society are part of this. Development is not about the government. Development is about a society. It's about everybody. That's what we're going to talk about over the course of this session. Now, when we think about development, your natural tendency is to be drawn to economic development. That's what we most often talk about when we talk about moving ahead the prosperity of a country. And of course, economic development is fundamental. Without economic development, there can't be the resources and the income to support a good quality of life. Without economic development, there can be no social development. But what we also now understand is that development is also about social development. It's also about moving the society forward, moving the quality of life of the citizens forward, moving the sense of opportunity for everyone forward. And what we've learned over the last 20 years about development is we have to do these things together. We can't just think about economic development and forget about the society and forget about the people and forget about the quality of life and forget about the opportunities that citizens have. If we just think economics and don't think about society, we'll fail. That's happened over and over and over again. But at the same time, if we just think about improving society and providing more for citizens and making the quality of life better, but we fail to make the hard decisions to improve our economic development, we'll also fail. Because we won't have the resources, we won't have the money, we won't have the capacity to do social development unless we're succeeding in economic development. I think probably one of the most important lessons about development that we've learned in the world in the last 20 years is you've got to do these things together. And where we don't do that, we fail every time. I could give you dozens of examples. And so at this moment in Paraguay, as we come together around transformation, we have to have a strategy in both of these areas. And we have to see how these things connect together. What we've learned is that economic development is very powerful in enabling social development. When you have improving incomes, when there's more jobs, when there's more economic opportunities, that creates good conditions for social progress. But we've also learned that without social progress, without the things that it brings in terms of knowledge and attitudes and sense of opportunity, actually you can't succeed at economic development. These things are dependent on each other. And again, we have to develop them together. So Paraguay is going to need to have an economic strategy to address the fundamental economic development of the country and the improvement in the income But Paraguay's also going to need a really social development strategy to really bring up the capabilities and quality of life and circumstances of the citizens. Those two things have to happen together. And what I'd like to talk about today is the beginnings of that kind of thinking and some very exciting steps that are being taken in this country to put in place this vision. And the third thing I'd like to talk about today is how we get it done, how we get this done. And the big message there is that we need government, we need the institutions in civil society, but in many ways, the big missing piece we need to make this work is the private sector, business. Business traditionally has sort of been outside of these issues. It's been focused mostly on economic. It's been focused on primarily on, becoming, competitive as companies. But what we're now understanding is actually business must also take responsibility for social development, not just economic development. But with a philosophy that is very different than the traditional approach that businesses have taken towards society. So I'd like to spend a minute later talking about now what is the role of business in both economic and social development. The reality is that the private sector is where most of the resources are. The private sector is where most of the jobs are. The private sector is where most of the investment is. And we need the private sector engaged, deeply engaged in both of these agendas, but with a different mindset, with a different philosophy than perhaps we've seen historically. I believe very strongly that this country has an enormous opportunity. And I'll talk about why as we proceed this morning. But in order for that opportunity to be realized, most important thing we have to do is have a plan and work together. And in particular, I'd like to ask every business leader sitting here today to be part of this. Don't leave it to anybody else. Don't trust anybody else. Be part of it. Because we in the business community, I think, have assets and capabilities and efficiencies that will be enormously important to success. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the two pieces of development. Let's first talk about economic development. Paraguay is a country that actually is now showing some signs of quite good growth. And that is very exciting to see, and I'm sure exciting for all of you that are part of it. There's been some ups and downs, but I'm pretty convinced from the data that I've seen that there's a good opportunity to start a good growth path here over this year and next year and the coming years. The question is, how can we sustain improvement in economic development? Not just have a good year, but how can we be on a good path? And of course, the answer there is well known. In order to have economic development, you have to be competitive. You have to build competitiveness. Paraguay has to be a competitive place to do business. Businesses operating in Paraguay have to be competitive in the Latin American and the global marketplace. That's what it takes to have sustained economic growth. You can grow for 1 year by having the price of beef go up, or the price of some other commodity. You can grow in the short term by simply enjoying improvements in prices. in international commodities. But to really grow and sustain prosperity over time, you have to build a competitive economy, a truly competitive economy. Now, what do we mean by competitiveness? What does that word mean? What I find around the world is there's a lot of misunderstanding about competitiveness. Some people think that to be competitive, you have to have a low wage. Well, actually, that's the opposite. If you're competitive, you can have a high wage. If you're not competitive, you have a low wage. Competitiveness is about creating the conditions in a country to allow companies to compete, but also to support a rising wage and standard of living for the country and for the citizens. Competitiveness occurs where these two things happen together, where companies can compete, but where workers and citizens can have a good income and a good standard of living. Competitiveness occurs when those happen together. And that can only occur when you create an environment for business in a country of very high productivity. If you're productive, if you can produce a lot of output with a day of work, very high quality products and very sophisticated products with a day of work, you can have a high wage. If you're productive, you can have a high wage. If you're not very productive compared to other places, then you're going to have to live with a very low wage. So the per capita income of a country, we find, is almost completely explained by productivity. How productive the country, the location is as a place to do business. And productivity, of course, has a lot to do with skills, and it has to do with efficiency, and it has to do with a lot of other things that I'll talk about in a minute. To be competitive, you don't have a low wage. A low wage is failure. If you have to compete by cutting your salary, you've failed at competitiveness. Competitiveness is about creating the conditions and the skills and the situation where you can support a high wage because you can do things efficiently and productively, because you have skill, because you're sophisticated, because you can produce excellent quality. That's competitiveness. Competitiveness isn't letting your currency fall. You know, if your currency has to go down to enable you to balance your macroeconomic flows, that's a sign that you're not competitive. The competitive countries have a strong currency because they're productive and they can support that strong currency. And when your currency goes up in value, that means everybody in the country gets richer. Because all of a sudden your currency is worth more and you can buy more in the foreign markets. And you can sell your work for a higher price. So again, the critical issue we have to understand in economic development is that it's all about productivity. It's all about creating an environment in the country where business can be highly productive. And that's not just local companies, but it's also anybody else that wants to come here and work in Paraguay. Multinationals. We want to not only be a good place to grow local companies, and there's some wonderful local companies here, but we want to be a place where multinationals want to do business. You know, it should be the case that in Brazil's a mess. It's very complicated in Brazil. Getting anything done in Brazil is like difficult. We need to create an environment here in Paraguay where a Brazilian company would rather work here and grow their crops here and make their products here because it's simple, because it's easy, because we're efficient, because we have a good environment for business here. We're not all complicated because government's so involved in regulating everything. Okay, that's what we got to do to be competitive. That's what allows an economy to grow over a long period of time, is building that capability and then building up the local economy in a way that reflects our areas of unique strength. We need to figure out where Paraguay can build some unique strengths in terms of its economic activity, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the most important thing we have to understand is that economic development doesn't come because we pass a law to open up trade. It's not easy. Economic development comes only by the hard work of making everything we do productive. Creating all the infrastructure and institutions we need to make business productive here. That's the hard work of economic development. Now, what creates a productive economy? This is a question we've been studying now among thinkers and scholars and economic development people for many, many years. And we're starting, I think, to get a very clear answer. A productive economy starts with the endowments of a country. It's sort of the foundation. Endowments are what you inherited. You have a certain natural resource. You have certain position in the world. You know, Paraguay is in a strategic location between Argentina and Brazil, two very large economies. So that's an endowment. We didn't create that. We were lucky. We just were born with that. We had this location. We have water. We have good growing conditions. We have certain historical legacy and certain kinds of a history and a natural beauty that might give us an opportunity to develop tourism. Every location starts with endowments. What you inherited, the size of the country, the people living here. Those are the endowments. And that gives you some opportunities to improve productivity and prosperity. But what we find is that the endowment you have helps, but it doesn't truly determine prosperity. What really determines prosperity is not what endowment you inherited, but what you do with your endowment. I mean, you can have very good growing conditions, but if you're not able to be productive in farming, you don't take advantage of that endowment. You know, you can have a lot of potential for clean energy, which you do in this country because of the hydroelectric capabilities and the potential for wind power. The potential is there, but unless you use that potential, unless you make the right investments and put in the right technology and develop the right kind of efficiency in generating that power, the endowment itself will help. You can get some money for that, but the more productively you use your endowment, that's how you really get wealthy. That's how you really get prosperous. You know, poor countries basically just sell their endowment. They sell cheap labor, they sell their minerals they dig out of the ground, they sell those. They do simple things based on their endowments. That's why they're poor, because they're not productive in translating their resources, their land, their water, their energy into value in the form of goods and services that are produced efficiently. So competitiveness and productivity starts with endowment, but only starts there. What we know is the next level of competitiveness is what we call macroeconomic competitiveness. And that says that on top of the endowment we have to create a broad sort of context that cuts across the entire economy, and that's what we call macroeconomic competitiveness. And the most kind of important lesson we've learned historically about macroeconomic competitiveness has to do with the need for very sound monetary and fiscal policy. We have to have a sound budgetary situation in the country where the budget is in balance. We have to control inflation. We have to create the circumstances where we can maintain the value of the currency. Monetary and fiscal policy is sort of a foundation as well. If we don't have stable monetary and fiscal policy and a central bank that we're in right now that does its job well, it's very hard to develop a productive economy. If there's always worry about devaluation and inflation and the budget not being balanced, then what will happen is the private sector will not invest, will not develop its productivity. You know, the idea that you need a sound fiscal policy, the idea that you need to worry about having a sound, you know, balanced budget, that you need to worry about making investments, government investments that are the best investments in terms of improving the productive potential of the country. That principle is a fundamental lesson of competitiveness that we've learned all over the world. So this is a foundation. And I know that there's a debate now about what our budget policy should be in this country and how we should set that budget and how we should think about the budget. But this is going to determine a lot of your future in terms of competitiveness. If you have a sound, stable process of setting and budgeting in this country and use the resources to make good investments, you'll do well. On the other hand, if you use the budget to try to please everybody and give everybody money for whatever reason they want, you're not going to do well. It's not hard. It's not complicated. The countries only have limited resources. You've got to use those resources well to deliver the best value for the society. So this is a foundation. But what we've also found is even if you have a sound monetary and fiscal policy, and historically Paraguay has some good history here. You know, you've never defaulted. You've tended to be more fiscally responsible here than many other countries. That's good. But even if you do that well, that's not enough for competitiveness. Because really the ultimate driver of competitiveness is what we call microeconomic competitiveness. It's not having the sound context. It's really building the capability in the economy itself. And that starts with companies. You cannot have a competitive economy unless you have competitive companies. Unless companies working here use the latest technologies, are sophisticated, that are well managed, that are constantly improving their staff and improving the way they do business. A competitive economy really starts with competitive companies. So all of you in this room that are running companies, you are the front line of competitiveness of this country. And the better managed your company is, and the more up-to-date it is, and the more sophisticated it is in terms of management and supply chain and production techniques and how you do business, you know, that is going to ultimately drive the success of this economy. So all of us in business, our job is to be competitive companies. And that means we got to run our companies well. And we got to make good choices about products and quality and how we compete. And we got to be at the world class if we're going to actually have an economy that is the kind of economy we want. But again, companies can only be competitive if they have a competitive business environment to work in. Let me give you an example. When I was coming here a few minutes ago, all I saw was traffic. Okay? There was lots of traffic. And everybody was moving at like 3 miles an hour. Okay? Now, if a business in Paraguay that's trying to produce a product or service, every time they try to do something with perhaps ship their goods, if all their trucks always go at 3 miles an hour, can't be competitive. That's expensive. So you can see that having an efficient infrastructure to move goods and services and people around, really important to competitiveness. If you want to be productive, you can't waste time sitting in traffic. So that's why to build a competitive firm, you have to have a good business environment, and that includes a lot of things. In looking at the business environment, kind of the framework that we've developed over the years and tested says that the business environment means you've got to have good inputs. So you need people that have skill to do their job well. And you need good infrastructure. And that's airports, that's roads, that's water transportation. This country's lucky enough to have these rivers and the ability to use water transportation. We've got to make sure that whole system works. And the rivers are prepared for moving goods, so they're dredged and prepared. And we have the right port facilities to do that efficiently and well. So that's part of the business environment. And we need to have some technological infrastructure in the country. We need in our universities and other institutions, we need to build some technological capabilities so we can understand the cutting edge ideas of manufacturing and product design and so forth in our various fields. Now, this country shouldn't try to spend time on very basic science, but really, we're an agricultural nation. We have to build the capability in agricultural technology. We have to understand that if we're going to be a productive economy. Again, it's not something we can't do. We can do it. This is a country that should be a leader in clean energy. So we have to have capability in this country to understand that technology and that field, so we can take advantage of the opportunities we have. The business environment starts with the inputs, the people, the infrastructure, the technology. All those things are critical to the success of companies operating here. When a company comes to Paraguay, it's going to want to make sure that the infrastructure is good. It's going to want to make sure that the people, they can hire people that want to work and that are at least partially trained so that the company can then train them even further. We need an environment in Paraguay, if we're going to be competitive, a business environment that really supports competition. What we've learned about competitiveness is if you don't have to compete at home, you'll never compete abroad. If you have a monopoly in the local market and you don't have to compete with anybody, the idea that you will be productive, it's crazy. So we've got to make sure that we have an economy where everybody has to compete. And nobody's really protected from competition because it makes everybody better. And it makes productivity go up. And it's a critical part of competitiveness. We need a business environment where we have availability of supporting industries. So that when you need to ship your goods, you don't necessarily have to do it yourself. There's a good shipping company that you can get to help you. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Again, this is a subject we could spend the entire session on. How do you create the right business environment? It's not complicated intellectually. It's pretty obvious. You know, many of these things are pretty obvious. The question is, how do you get it done? And that's why you need an economic strategy. You need an economic strategy to decide what are the most important things to do now to improve the business environment. Because you can't do everything. We don't have the resources or the people to do everything. We've got to set priorities. And good economic strategies are ones that set the priorities that are most important today, and then they work on those things, and then they move to the next things, and the next things, and the next things. It's kind of a never-ending process because you want your productivity and your wages and your income just to keep going up and up. And to do that, you've got to keep raising your standards and expecting more and demanding better, a better environment and more sophistication and better skill. That's the process of economic development. There's no magic formula. There's no easy answer. It's just a lot of work. You've got to improve your laws. You've got to improve your infrastructure. You've got to improve your technical training. One area after another. You've got to keep making things better. And you know, Paraguay has a good foundation. But, you know, we're pretty low income. And that low income reflects the fact that we have a long way to go in improving our business environment. And improving the capabilities of the companies here in the country. And creating even more attractive situation where new companies will come here to do business, and that will help us accelerate the progress that we make. There's one other critical piece in the microeconomic environment that we have to talk about, and that's the concept of clusters. What we find is that countries, particularly countries like Paraguay that are of your size, it's very hard to be competitive across the entire economy. Because there's just too much to know. There's too much to do. You can't do that. What we actually see in reality is that where countries are competitive, there's a number of fields, a relatively small number of fields of the total possibility where that country can build up its unique position. And a critical mass of firms and institutions and suppliers in that particular field. And that's what we call a cluster. So here's an example of a cluster. In tourism. So the idea is if you're going to be really, really competitive in tourism, you don't need just hotels. You got, you know, yes, if you want to be in tourism, you got to have hotels for the visitors to stay. But you also need things for them to see. And some of those things maybe are part of your history and part of your natural beauty, but you have to create things that visitors want to see. But then you also need places for them to eat. And you also need transportation so that the tourists can move around. And you also need things that they can buy because tourists like to buy souvenirs. And you want some interesting things for them to buy. And you can see on this chart, actually to be successful in tourism, you need a lot of industries to come together. And that's a cluster. Where you just have one hotel and one tourist attraction, you maybe can do okay, but you're never going to really build true success in tourism in this country until you build a real cluster. And the same is true in beef, and the same is true in soybeans, and the same is true in energy. Those are areas where I think Paraguay has the beginnings of a cluster. And what we find is that the true growth and job creation and wage improvement happens where you can build a cluster. If you have just one firm doing it by themselves, sitting off on their own, you'll never see a tremendous growth. What you see is that growth comes when you can build a cluster.